A bulldozer's high beams locked onto my cabin at 2 a.m., its treads grinding closer through the snow. Inside, I stayed in the dark, phone recording, knowing this was the moment Mason would lose. Subscribe for more gripping stories like this. It started with the sound of tires crunching over gravel. Slow, deliberate, and far too close to my cabin for comfort. I had been splitting kindling behind the shed when the sound reached me, sharp against the crisp air of late October. The last of the maples had shed their leaves, and the only vehicles that usually made it this far up the ridge belonged to hunters or lost delivery drivers. This wasn't either. The noise was too steady, too confident. The SUV appeared a moment later, black, spotless, with the kind of tinted windows that turned the afternoon sun into a glare you couldn't see past. It rolled to a stop right at the edge of my porch, engine idling with a faint, expensive purr. The vehicle didn't belong here. Up on Elk's Crown Ridge, you either drove a dented pickup, a mud-splattered Jeep, or nothing at all. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in an expensive tailored jacket that didn't match the terrain. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, he scanned my property like a surveyor. His boots were clean, too clean, and the way he moved screamed that he wasn't here for a social visit. "You Jonathan Hale?" he called, his voice carrying over the wind. I set my hatchet down on the chopping block and nodded. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that warmed you. It was calculated. The kind you get from someone who's closed 100 deals and plans on closing one more today. "Name's Rick Mason," he said, strolling toward the porch without waiting for an invitation. "I represent the Timberline Development Group. We're starting a restoration project down in Hollow Creek. Luxury vacation homes, eco-friendly rentals, the whole deal. Your place here is right in the middle of our projected road expansion." I laughed, short and sharp. "Then you'll need to change your projection." That's when the smile twitched. Barely noticeable, but there. "We're prepared to make a very generous offer. Triple market value, cash, no inspections, no delays. We can have you relocated before winter." "No sale," I said, folding my arms. He studied me for a long moment, then stepped closer, boots creaking on the porch boards my grandfather had laid 60 years ago. His gaze wandered over the beams and the hand-cut stone chimney, like he was appraising it for demolition. "Well," he said finally, tucking the clipboard under his arm, "I hope you don't regret that." He turned and walked back to the SUV, that polished smile still in place, but his shoulders set tighter. When he drove off, the crunch of tires faded into the stillness of the ridge, but the unease he left behind didn't fade with it. I should have known then it wasn't just a sales pitch. It was a warning. That night, the first accident happened. It was close to midnight, and I was dozing in my recliner by the wood stove when the generator cut out. No flicker, no warning, just sudden, dead silence. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the cold. The extension cord running from the shed had been severed, not frayed from wear, not chewed by animals, cut, clean, straight, with the kind of precision you only get from a sharp blade. The next morning I found the back gate standing wide open, the latch broken clean through. My wood pile, stacked tight the week before, was scattered like someone had plowed through it. By the third day, I decided to check the trail cameras I'd mounted along the ridge. I expected deer, maybe a nosy black bear. What I found instead made my stomach knot. 2 men in reflective vests were walking directly past the posted private property signs. One carried a heavy bolt cutter, the other a clipboard, and I recognized one of them. Rick Mason's nephew. I didn't call the sheriff right away. Out here, you learn that calling the law too soon can backfire. Deputies have their own priorities, and if someone's got money and influence, which Mason clearly did, you might find the problem turned back on you. Instead, I copied every image and video clip from the trail cams, labeling them with dates and times. I uploaded them to a secure cloud drive that an old army buddy had helped me set up years ago. If Timberline wanted a fight, I wasn't going to be caught flat-footed. 2 days later, a bright orange envelope appeared on my front door. Notice of unsafe dwelling conditions. Immediate action required. The paper was stamped with a county seal, but the font was wrong. It looked off, like someone had copied it from a website and printed it in a hurry. The kicker was at the bottom. Instead of being signed by a county inspector, it was signed by Timberline Safety Compliance Department. That's when I knew they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I tore the notice down, crumpled it, and burned it in the wood stove. A part of me wanted to drive into town, find Mason, and have a face-to-face conversation that would leave no room for misunderstandings. But that's the kind of move they were hoping for. Something rash, something they could spin into aggressive mountain man threatens local businessman. The next week was a steady drip of harassment. My mail stopped arriving. Later, I'd find out it had been misdelivered to an empty property Timberline had just bought. My internet went down for 3 days straight. The county assessor's office sent me a letter claiming my property taxes had tripled, effective immediately due to commercial zoning adjustments. I called the office myself and was told very politely that no such adjustment existed. On the fourth day, I caught them in the act again. It was just before dawn, and I was sipping coffee when I heard the faint whine of an ATV coming up the fire road. I slipped out the back door and circled wide, keeping low. Through the pines, I saw two figures unloading equipment, rolls of bright orange survey tape, wooden stakes, and a gas-powered auger. They were marking my land. I snapped a dozen photos from 3 different angles, making sure their faces were clear. As I moved in closer, one of them turned, and we locked eyes for a brief moment. It was Mason's nephew again. He froze, then muttered something to the other guy. They grabbed their gear and bolted, the ATV spitting gravel as they tore back down the slope. That was when I decided this wasn't just a defensive fight anymore. It was time to go on the offensive. That night, I started compiling everything. Every incident, every forged document, every cut wire and broken latch. I wrote a timeline, cross-referenced it with the photos and videos, and added in public records showing Timberline's recent property buys. They weren't just after me. They were buying up everything within 5 miles of the ridge, piece by piece. But my cabin? That was the crown jewel. My land connected 2 of their biggest parcels, and without it, their restoration project would be split in 2. I wasn't dealing with a greedy businessman. I was dealing with someone who decided my home was already his and would push until I broke. The problem for Rick Mason was that I wasn't the breaking type. The first step was to make sure I had eyes on my property at all times. My old trail cams were good, but I needed better. I drove into the nearest town, 30 miles of winding road, and bought 4 high-resolution security cameras, the kind that could record in pitch darkness and store footage both locally and in the cloud. I also picked up 2 solar panels, a backup generator, and enough motion sensors to cover every approach from the fire road to the creek bed. By nightfall, the ridge was wired like a small fortress. If Mason or his crew so much as breathed near my fence line, I'd know about it. Sure enough, it didn't take long. 3 nights later, my phone buzzed at 2:13 a.m. The alert was from the west perimeter camera, near the old logging trail. I swiped the notification and the live feed came up. 2 figures, both in hoodies and carrying flashlights, were moving along the tree line. One stopped to cut a length of barbed wire, while the other knelt to hammer a stake into the ground. And then, the taller one stepped forward into full view of the lens. Rick Mason. The man wasn't even sending his lackeys anymore. He was here himself, in the dark, committing trespass and property damage on camera. I didn't go outside. I didn't shout. I didn't fire a warning shot, even though my shotgun was leaning against the wall 2 feet away. I just recorded. I let the footage roll until they finished marking whatever line they thought they owned, then watched as they walked back to a waiting pickup at the bottom of the hill. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office, not to report the trespass, but to request a copy of the county's land survey records. I wanted proof of my boundary lines, and I wanted it in writing from a public office that Mason couldn't manipulate. The clerk who handed me the file was an older woman named June, who had been working there for 30 years. When she saw my name on the request, she frowned. "You having trouble with Timberline?" she asked. I didn't answer directly, but the look I gave her must have said enough. She leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a whisper. "You didn't hear this from me, but you're not the only one. They've been leaning hard on folks up on the North Ridge, too. 2 families sold just last week after accidents started happening. Be careful." I thanked her and left with my papers, but her words stuck in my head the whole drive back. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Mason's tactics, the forged notices, the intimidation, the sabotage, were a pattern, and patterns could be exposed. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of printed photos, property maps, and timestamps. I started drafting a letter, but not to Mason and not to the sheriff. This one was addressed to the local news station, the only one in the county that wasn't owned by one of Mason's business partners. I didn't tell them everything in the first email, just enough to get their attention. A timeline of incidents, photos of Mason trespassing, copies of the fake unsafe dwelling notice, survey maps proving his stakes were inside my property lines. I ended it with one line. If you want the full story, bring a camera crew to Elks Crown Ridge this Saturday at noon. It was a gamble. If they didn't show, Mason would keep pushing. If they did, I'd have witnesses and a platform. And by Saturday morning, the ridge would be ready for them. Saturday came with a low ceiling of clouds and the smell of snow in the air. By 9 a.m., I'd already done 3 sweeps of the property, checking camera angles, clearing the porch, and making sure my backup generator was fueled and ready. If there was going to be a scene, I wanted no excuses about bad visibility or technical issues. Everything would be recorded twice, my cameras and whatever the news crew brought. Around 10:30, a white van with the station's logo rumbled up the fire road, its tires crunching over the frozen gravel. A reporter climbed out first, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, wearing a red parka, followed by a cameraman hauling a tripod and a heavy shoulder rig. "You the one who emailed about Timberline?" she asked. "That's me," I said, and I could tell from the way she studied my cabin, solid logs, smoke curling from the chimney, that she'd been expecting something more, run down, something that fit a narrative of hermit holds out in dilapidated shack. Mason probably told her I was living in some half-collapsed hunting hut. "I'm Mara," she said, shaking my hand. "This is Craig. We're rolling whenever you are." I led them inside, sat them down at the kitchen table, and walked them through everything. The trespass footage, the forged notices, the cut wires, the intimidation. Mara's eyebrows kept climbing higher, and Craig's camera never wavered. When I pulled up the video of Mason himself driving stakes into my land at 2 in the morning, Mara let out a low whistle. "This is a lot more than what we've been hearing from the other folks," she said. "You've got names, dates, documents. This isn't just hearsay. It's a pattern," I told her, "and I'm betting you've already heard from some of the other people he's been pushing." She didn't answer, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. I was right. At exactly noon, just as I'd hoped, the Sioux and of engines came from down the road. 2 black pickups appeared first, both with Timberline's logo on the doors. Behind them, a silver SUV rolled into view, and out stepped Rick Mason in a tailored coat, his smirk visible even from 30 yards away. "Here we go," I murmured to Mara. Mason strode toward the porch like he owned it, ignoring the camera entirely. "We've got to talk," he said, as if this were some neighborly misunderstanding. "Anything you've got to say, you can say right here," I replied, stepping aside just enough so Craig's camera had a perfect view. He glanced toward the lens for the first time and faltered, just a fraction, before his smirk came back. "I'm here to serve you with notice of eminent domain. The county's taking this property for the restoration project. You'll get fair market value." I held up the fresh survey maps from the assessor's office. "Funny, because according to the county, there's no such project approved, and you're standing on private land, uninvited again." Mara didn't say a word, but Craig zoomed in tight on Mason's face. Then I pulled the final card. I had queued the trespass footage from 3 nights ago on my laptop, connected by HDMI to a small monitor I'd set on the porch railing. With one tap, Mason's face filled the screen, night vision green, hood down, hammering stakes into my property at 2:14 a.m. For the first time, the smirk vanished. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with," he said, voice low, almost a growl. "Oh, I think we all do now," Mara cut in, finally speaking. "And so will everyone watching tonight at 6. Mason's jaw tightened. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked back toward his SUV, the black pickups rumbling to life behind him. But I knew this wasn't over, not yet. The real fight was just about to start, and now it was in the public eye. The station's van rolled away before Mason's taillights even faded from sight. Mara promised me the segment would run that evening, unedited and in full. She looked almost excited, like she knew this wasn't just a puff piece about rural land disputes, but the kind of story that could ignite a bigger fire. I barely had time to breathe before my phone rang. Unknown number. Yeah, I answered, expecting maybe a follow-up question from Mara. Instead, a male voice with the kind of fake friendliness you only hear from bureaucrats or con men said, "This is Deputy Hall with the County Sheriff's Office. We've received a complaint about you threatening a local business owner with a firearm." My pulse didn't spike, not yet, but I leaned against the counter and forced my voice calm. "Let me guess. Rick Mason?" "Ma'am, I'm not at liberty to discuss—" "You are, if you're calling my phone at my home," I cut in. "And for the record, I haven't fired a shot or even touched a gun today. I've got video of my entire afternoon with time-stamped footage, multiple witnesses, and a news crew who will happily testify otherwise." There was a pause on the other end. Then Hall said, "We'll still need to send someone out to talk to you. Stay where you are." The line went dead. I glanced at my cameras. Sure enough, less than 15 minutes later, a sheriff's SUV was crawling up my drive. Not Hall. This one was driven by a man I didn't recognize. He stepped out, posture stiff, hand resting on his belt like he expected trouble. "Afternoon," he said, eyes scanning my porch. "Mind if I come in?" "I do mind," I said, "but I don't mind talking to you right here on camera." I nodded toward the lens mounted above my door, the red indicator light glowing. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "We got a report you threatened Mr. Mason with a weapon. Just need to clear that up." "Clee, are it up?" "Sure, I have 3 cameras that recorded our entire interaction, and the only thing in my hand was a survey map." I pulled my phone from my pocket and hit play, showing him Mason's visit from start to finish, complete with Mara and Craig's footage in the background. When it ended, the deputy blew out a slow breath. "Well, that's not what he told us." "Shocking," I said dryly. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Off the record. Watch your back. Mason's got friends in town, and some of them wear badges." He left without taking a statement. The message was clear. Mason was moving to Plan B, turn law enforcement into his private hammer. If he couldn't scare me off directly, he'd try to bury me under false accusations until I cracked. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every snap of a branch outside, every gust of wind against the siding had me glancing at the monitors. Mason had made his first false report today. Tomorrow, it could be something worse, something that might actually stick if I wasn't ready, but I wasn't the only one preparing. At sunrise, my inbox pinged with an email from Mara. It contained a single sentence. "You might want to watch the county Facebook page." When I clicked the link, I saw it. My story, broadcast in full, racking up shares faster than I could refresh the page. And in the comments, half the county was piling on Mason, posting their own run-ins, their own horror stories, their own evidence. The tide was turning, but tides have a way of pulling things under before they recede. I had no illusions. Mason wasn't going to retreat quietly. He'd come back harder, and probably sooner than I expected. By noon the next day, the first official blow of Mason's counterattack landed. A county envelope stamped "Urgent" was shoved under my front door. No knock, no greeting, just paper and footsteps crunching away. Inside was a notice of code violations that looked like it had been cobbled together by someone who had only skimmed the building codes once and decided they could wing it. According to this document, my cabin was unfit for habitation due to structural concerns, improper heating equipment, and, my favorite, non-compliance with community aesthetic standards. I knew exactly what that meant. Mason had friends in the permit office, willing to sign off on whatever he needed to create pressure. I called the number listed for compliance officer. A bored-sounding clerk picked up. "Yeah, hi," I said. "I'm looking at this violation notice, and I want to know which inspector actually came to my property." Says here it was visual survey only," the clerk replied. "Meaning?" "Meaning they drove by and, looked." "Looked," I repeated, deadpan. "From the road, through a stand of pine trees, in a snowstorm." "Yeah, that's standard procedure." "Right," I said, keeping my voice even. Thanks for clearing that up. I hung up, set the phone down, and stared at the paper. This was Mason's next play. Death by bureaucracy. If he could get the county to slap enough fines on me or condemn the property, he could make me fight a war on two fronts, in the courts and on the land. But Mason underestimated how stubborn I could be. By 2 p.m., I'd scanned every document related to my cabin's permits, including the structural inspection signed off just last summer. I sent the whole package, plus a copy of the bogus violation notice, to Mara with the subject line, Round 2. She replied in less than 10 minutes. We'll make it a series. That eviaos. Evening the second segment aired. It wasn't just about me this time. Mara had interviewed 3 other residents who'd been hit with mysterious code violations right after refusing to sell their land to Timberline. 2 of them had phone records showing calls from Mason's office the day before the notices arrived. The fallout online was immediate and vicious. Hashtags with Mason's name and words like crook and land grab started trending locally. My inbox flooded with messages from people offering to testify, share documents, or even show up at my property if things got hairy. That last part made me uneasy. I didn't want a crowd here. The whole point was to keep my home safe and calm, but it was good to know I wasn't alone in this anymore. Just as I was shutting down my laptop for the night, a motion alert popped up on my security system. Camera 3, the one by the back tree line. I opened the feed and froze. A figure in dark clothing, hood up, was moving along the edge of my property, crouching low and stopping every few steps to do something I couldn't quite see in the dim infrared light. Not wildlife, not a hiker, and definitely not just passing through. They were planting something. I grabbed my flashlight and my phone, thumb hovering over 911, and stepped quietly onto the porch. The cold bit at my face, and the snow underfoot crunched just loud enough to make my pulse spike. When I reached the edge of the yard, the figure straightened and turned. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Then they bolted into the trees, vanishing into the black. I waited until my breathing slowed before approaching the spot where they'd been working. What I found made my stomach turn, and my resolve harden. It wasn't just stakes this time. It was trail cameras, 6 of them, hidden in the brush, all pointing toward my cabin, and every single on. He had Timberline's logo etched into the side. I carried the nearest trail camera back to my porch like it was a piece of rotten meat. Even through gloves, I felt grimy touching it. The Timberline logo was laser-etched into the casing, neat and professional, like they weren't even trying to hide who'd put it there. Inside, I set it on the table and powered it down before yanking the SD card. Years of living out here had taught me to keep a card reader handy. When I slid the card into my laptop, the folder structure popped up instantly. Dozens of files. The first video was from last week, long before today's stunt. Angles from the tree line, the driveway, even a partial view into my windows when the curtains were open. Some clips showed me carrying groceries. Others caught me splitting wood, talking on the porch, letting the dog out. Surveillance. Weeks worth. The next folder was newer. Footage from today, time-stamped just hours earlier. Whoever planted these cameras had been moving around my property for a while before I spotted them. And judging by the audio, they were talking to someone on a radio the entire time. A man's voice, faint but distinct, came through in one clip. West side's done. Moving to east perimeter. Another voice, lower, slower, responded. Copy. Get full coverage. Boss wants a clean sweep. I didn't need a forensic analyst to tell me who Boss was. I copied every file onto a backup drive and then onto a cloud account I kept for situations just like this. Then I picked up my phone and called Mara. This isn't just a land dispute anymore, I told her. They've been running an illegal surveillance operation on my property for weeks. I've got the footage. She swore softly under her breath. Get me a copy. I'll send it to my editor tonight. Not just your editor, I said. The sheriff, too. And maybe the state police. I knew the sheriff's office was compromised. Maybe not, too. He whole department, but enough that Mason could get favors pulled. The state, though, was a different story. They loved a case where they could swoop in and embarrass local authorities. I didn't have to wait long for Mason's response. At 10 the next morning, I woke to the sound of an engine idling outside. Not a car, heavy equipment. When I looked out the window, my stomach dropped. A Timberline-branded backhoe sat at the edge of my driveway, bucket raised, blocking the only clear exit to the main road. Two men in high-vis jackets leaned against it, smoking. I stepped outside, camera rolling. "Morning, gentlemen. Can I help you?" One of them smirked. "Just here to clear some debris for the county. Got orders to make sure the right-of-way is maintained." "Right-of-way?" I repeated. "This is a private driveway." He shrugged, still smirking. "County says otherwise." I recognized the tactic. Mason wasn't coming for me with papers this time. He was sending muscle, dressed up as public service. If I took a swing at them, they'd have all the excuse they needed to arrest me. So I smiled instead. "Perfect. Hold that thought." I walked back inside, called Mara again, and told her to bring a camera crew immediately. If Mason wanted to turn this into a show, I was going to sell tickets. By the time the crew arrived, the two men had been joined by a third, and Mason himself. He stood near the backhoe, arms folded, wearing that smug, performative patience of someone who thinks they've already won. "Morning," he said, like we were old friends meeting for coffee. "Looks like your driveway's getting some much-needed maintenance." "Looks like trespassing to me," I said, keeping my voice light for the microphones. He gestured toward the men. "These boys are just doing their job. But if you'd like to speed things up, maybe we can talk about an offer for that property of yours." And there it was, the not-so-subtle threat wrapped in a fake olive branch. The camera crew caught every word. The air between us had that tight, brittle feel of an incoming storm, not the kind you hear on the weather radio, but the kind that starts with a small noise and ends with sirens. The camera crew's boom mic swung slightly in the breeze, its black foam cover like a silent witness. Mason seemed aware of it, his eyes flicking toward it more than once, but he didn't stop talking. "You've got a good piece of land here," he said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Be a shame if it kept giving you trouble." The threat was paper thin, but it was there. I gave him nothing back but a slow smile. "Trouble like your guys trespassing?" I asked. Mara's cameraman circled us, getting both my face and Mason's in frame. Mason shifted slightly, shoulders tightening under his coat. He wanted control of the scene, but he wasn't used to being the one on defense. "This is county business," Mason replied, voice cooling, "and we have every right to ensure access through a public easement." I held up a folder I'd brought from inside. "Funny thing about that, I checked the plat maps this morning. No public easement here. This drive is entirely on my deed, which means you, your crew, and that backhoe are about 2 minutes from being on record for criminal trespass." I nodded toward Mara's camera. "And guess what? The county prosecutor's going to see this footage, too." The smirk faded. One of Mason's workers looked at him, clearly unsure if they should keep standing there. The tension cracked just a little. Then Mason played his next card. He pulled out his phone, scrolled, and held it up so I could see. On the screen was a photo of my cabin, a recent one, taken from a high angle, almost certainly from one of the cameras I'd pulled out of the woods. "Nice place," he said softly. "You sure you want to make this harder than it needs to be?" Mara caught that on film. I saw her eyes go wide behind the camera as she realized he'd just implicated himself on record. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only he and the mic could hear. "You just admitted to illegal surveillance on my property, Mason, and you did it with a news camera pointed at you. How's that feel?" His jaw twitched. Behind us, one of his men muttered, "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut it," Mason snapped. But it was too late. The mood had shifted. His hired muscle wasn't here for a suicide mission. They didn't want to be on the wrong side of a felony charge. Slowly, almost sheepishly, they climbed back into the backhoe and a battered pickup. Mason stood there for a moment longer, squaring his shoulders like he wanted to reclaim the upper hand. But the cameras were rolling, and there was nothing left for him to say that wouldn't dig his hole deeper. "See you around," he muttered, then turned and walked to his SUV. The engines rumbled to life, and within minutes, the blockade was gone. The sound of the retreating vehicles faded into the still winter air. Mara dropped the camera from her shoulder and exhaled. That man just gift-wrapped his own indictment. "Yeah," I said, watching the tree line, "but he's not done yet." Because I knew Mason. That retreat wasn't surrender. It was just the pause before his next move, and the next one was going to come fast. That night, my motion sensors tripped 3 separate times. Each time, the cameras caught nothing more than shadows slipping between the trees. And then, just after midnight, my phone buzzed with a single text from an unknown number. "You can't watch the woods forever." The text burned in my mind long after the screen went dark. I stared at it, thumb hovering over the call button, but I didn't bother replying. People like Mason thrived on reaction. The more you bit, the more they pulled. Better to collect the bait, label it, and stick it in the evidence jar. Still, I wasn't about to sleep after that. I slid on a coat and stepped outside with my flashlight, scanning the tree line. The snow reflected the beam in sharp shards, but the woods themselves were still. Too still. Gronk padded out beside me, his breath pluming in the cold. His ears twitched once, toward the west ridge, but he didn't bark. That was worse. If it had been a deer or a raccoon, he'd have been sounding off. This was something he didn't quite know how to classify. Something human. I walked the perimeter until my boots felt like blocks of ice. No footprints, no fresh disturbances in the snow, but I knew better than to believe they'd leave obvious signs. The surveillance cameras I'd installed after finding Mason's equipment fed straight to an encrypted server. I'd check them in the morning. At 3:12 a.m., the first call came. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes later, another, then another. By sunrise, I had 37 missed calls, all from different unlisted numbers. Each voicemail was the same: 20 seconds of silence, followed by a faint sound, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale, like someone standing inches from the mic. Harassment 101. I forwarded them all to Mara, who promised to send them to her tech contact for tracing. "But you know," she said, "even if we prove it's him, he'll claim it's some random prankster. Guys like this always have layers between them and the dirty work." She wasn't wrong. Mason's whole game was plausible deniability. He didn't set the traps. He paid people to do it for him. Around noon, the harassment shifted tactics. My mailbox, the heavy post-mounted one at the road, disappeared entirely. Not vandalized, not smashed, just gone, post and all. Snowshoe tracks led into the woods on both sides of the road. An hour later, a UPS truck stopped at the end of my drive. The driver, a kid barely 20, held out a large box. Someone sent you a package. No return address." I set it on the porch and cut the tape with my pocket knife. Inside was nothing but a single photograph. An aerial shot of my cabin, printed large with a red X drawn over it in marker. No note, no signature, just the X. I called the sheriff's office. The deputy who answered, not more, thankfully, promised to file a report, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Could be a prank," he said. "Right," I replied. "And maybe the cameras I pulled out of my woods last week were just misplaced wildlife trackers." By nightfall, Mara's story had aired. The footage of Mason standing in my driveway, backhoe behind him, smirking into the camera while hinting at an offer. It hit the local news like a dropped anvil. Social media was even less forgiving. But while the public roasted him, I knew Mason was the kind of man who didn't care about opinion polls. He cared about winning. At 2 a.m., just as I was finally dozing off, I woke to the distant grind of an engine, not on the road, but in the woods. Heavy, slow, deliberate. It was moving closer. And then the lights hit my cabin. 2 blinding high beams sweeping across the front like a searchlight, locking onto my windows and holding there. The high beams washed everything in white, erasing the shape of the porch, the yard, even the tree line. My eyes narrowed against the glare as Gronk growled low in his throat, the sound rolling through his chest like distant thunder. I didn't move toward the window. Not yet. Whoever was out there wanted me to step into the light, to make myself a clear silhouette. Instead, I stayed in the shadows by the wall, watching from an angle. The engine idled, deep and uneven, a diesel that had seen too many winters. Snowflakes swirled in the beams, each one a tiny spark in the frozen air. The minutes stretched. My heartbeat fell into rhythm with the distant hum, steady and slow. Finally, the lights shifted. The vehicle, big, maybe a logging skidder or a retrofitted tractor, crawled forward until its front bumper was nearly in my yard. That close, I could make out the outline of the cab through the glare. A shadowy figure sat behind the wheel, still as stone. I considered my options. I could step outside and confront them, but that was exactly what Mason, and whoever he'd sent, wanted. The other option was less satisfying but smarter. Document, record, and let them hang themselves with their own rope. I reached for the remote that controlled the floodlights mounted on the cabin roof. With a click, my property lit up from above, sharp white beams cutting down at angles that neutralized the glare from their headlights. The scene shifted instantly. Now I could see them clearly. An older, mud-caked bulldozer with a makeshift plow welded to the front, treads half buried in the snow. And inside, wearing a reflective vest over a heavy coat, was a face I recognized. Mason's nephew, a man whose temper was second only to his stupidity. He wasn't there to clear snow, he was there to send a message. I lifted my phone, letting him see the red recording light through the window. His jaw tightened, but he didn't cut the engine. Instead, he reached down to the dashboard and pulled something, a small black device with a blinking LED, holding it up like a trophy before tossing it into the snow. A tracker. Or maybe a wireless camera. Either way, he'd just told me exactly what Mason's next move was going to be. I didn't break eye contact with the lens as I called the sheriff's office on speaker. "This is my name. I've got trespassers operating heavy machinery on my property. I'm recording everything. I'll stay inside until you arrive." For a long moment, he didn't move. The wind howled between us, rattling the bare branches overhead. Then, without warning, he dropped the plow, scraped a wide gouge into the edge of my driveway, and reversed in a spray of snow. The bulldozer's engine roared, and within seconds, it was lumbering back into the dark. The deputies arrived 20 minutes later, long enough for me to recover the black device from the snow. It was, as I suspected, a GPS tracker with a cellular uplink, one more nail for Mason's coffin. By sunrise, I'd turned over the device, the footage, and the entire string of harassing calls to the investigators. Mara ran an update on the morning news, framing the late-night bulldozer visit as a failed attempt at intimidation. The footage went local viral within hours. The county prosecutor didn't take long. With the news pressure mounting, and with Mason's own people tying the noose tighter, warrants came down like an avalanche. Mason was arrested at his office before lunch, his nephew the same afternoon. Multiple charges: criminal trespass, harassment, destruction of property, illegal surveillance, stacked neatly in a list that would take a very good lawyer a very long time to unpack. That night, the mountain was quiet again. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the snow fall. Well, in the pale glow of the porch light, Gronk leaned against my leg, warm and solid, his eyes scanning the dark out of habit. The air had that rare stillness, the kind that seemed to hold the world in place for a few precious minutes. No engines, no threats, no unwanted lights cutting through the night. I'd learned something in those days, not about the law or about Mason, but about myself. You don't win these battles by out-yelling the other guy. You win them by outlasting him. The truth had been my weapon, patience my armor, and when the storm passed, I was still here. The mountain was mine again, and this time it would stay that way.